He died at the perfect time, my daughter-in-law whispered, and I knew, in that exact moment, that something about my son's death was not right. I did not turn. Not yet. I heard it clearly. I simply stood there beside the polished oak casket, my gloved hands resting lightly on its edge, as if I were just another grieving mother saying goodbye. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and furniture polish, the kind of scent that clings to places where people gather to pretend everything is dignified and orderly, even when their lives have just fallen apart. My son Daniel had always hated lilies. He used to joke that they smelled like fake sympathy. Yet here they were, lining the front of the room in tall white arrangements that Vanessa had personally selected. Of course she had. She had arranged everything. The service, the music, the guest list. Even the order in which people would speak. I hadn't been asked about any of it. Not once. I kept my eyes on the casket, on the small brass plaque that bore my son's name, trying to steady my breathing. Around me, the low murmur of voices rose and fell like a distant tide. People from Daniel's work. Neighbors. A few relatives who hadn't visited in years, but suddenly found the time to show up now. I wondered how many of them actually knew him anymore. How many of them had seen the quiet changes in him over the past year? The way his calls had become shorter, less frequent. The way he would hesitate before answering simple questions, as if someone were listening on the other end. "Margaret," someone said softly behind me, but I didn't turn. I couldn't, because if I did, I might accidentally look at Vanessa, and I wasn't ready for that. Not after what I had just heard. He died at the perfect time. The words echoed again in my mind, each repetition colder than the last. Perfect for what? For whom? I let my gaze drift slightly to the right, just enough to catch a glimpse of her reflection in the glass of a nearby picture frame. Vanessa stood a few feet away, dressed in black, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek, careful style. Her expression was composed, almost serene. She was speaking quietly to one of Daniel's colleagues, her hand resting lightly on his arm, offering comfort as if she were the one holding everything together. No one looking at her would suspect anything. That was always her strength. Composure. Control. I knew then. I remembered the first time Daniel brought her home, nearly 8 years ago. She had been charming. Attentive. The kind of woman who made you feel seen, even when she was really just studying you. I had ignored the small things back then. The way she answered questions for Daniel before he could speak. The way she laughed just a second too late, like she was calculating the right reaction. Over time, those small things had grown into something harder to define. Something quieter, but heavier. I had told myself it was just marriage. That people change. That distance happens. But standing here now, with my son lying still in a box that should never have held him this soon, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief. Not exactly. Grief had already settled into my bones days ago, heavy and familiar. This was something else. Something sharper. That was not grief. That was something else. I stepped back slowly, allowing another mourner to approach the casket. My movements were careful, deliberate, as if I were afraid that any sudden motion might draw attention. I moved toward the side of the room, where a row of empty chairs sat beneath a set of tall windows. Outside, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that threatened rain but never quite delivered. I sat down, smoothing my coat over my knees, and folded my hands in my lap. From here, I could see everything without being seen too closely. Vanessa moved through the room with quiet precision, greeting guests, accepting condolences, guiding conversations. At one point, she leaned in close to a man I didn't recognize and whispered something that made him nod quickly, his expression shifting to something almost cautious. I felt it again then. That same cold awareness. Like a puzzle piece sliding into place, even though I couldn't yet see the full picture. I thought about the last time I had spoken to Daniel in person. It had been 3 weeks ago. He had come by the house unexpectedly, his shoulders tense, his smile strained. We had sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon sun cutting across the floor in long, quiet lines. He had started to say something twice, both times stopping himself with a shake of his head. "It's nothing, Mom," he had said finally. "Just work stuff." But it hadn't been work. I knew that now. Or at least, I knew that whatever it was, it had followed him here. Into this room. Into this silence. I lifted my eyes again, this time letting them settle fully on Vanessa. She laughed softly at something someone said, her hand rising to touch her necklace, a small, delicate gold chain Daniel had given her years ago. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. Just a second, but it was enough. Because in that second, I didn't see grief. I didn't see loss. I saw calculation. And just as quickly, she smiled. A perfect, practiced smile. I lowered my gaze immediately, my expression unchanged. Let her think I was still just a grieving mother. Let her believe I hadn't heard a thing. Because whatever she meant by those words, I was going to find out. And when I did, I would be ready. I did not leave the chapel immediately after the service ended. Most people did. They gathered their coats, offered a few final words that sounded rehearsed, and slowly filtered out into the gray afternoon as if they were returning to a world that had not just lost my son. I remained seated for a while, watching the empty chairs, listening to the faint echo of footsteps fading down the hallway. The lilies still stood at the front, their scent heavier now that the room had quieted. Vanessa had stepped outside with a small group, her voice carrying faintly through the open doors, calm and steady, as if she had already begun moving on to whatever came next. I waited until I was certain she would not come back in before I stood. My legs felt stiff, but not from grief. From stillness. From holding myself together for longer than I realized. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, stopping a few feet from the casket. Up close, the details felt sharper. The grain of the wood. The precise alignment of the flowers. Everything was exactly as it had been arranged. Controlled. I placed my hand lightly on the edge again, but this time I did not close my eyes. Instead, I let my mind drift back, not to Daniel as a child or even as a young man, but to the past year. The last 12 months that now felt less like memories and more like fragments of something I had not fully understood at the time. There had been small changes, subtle enough that I had explained them away. He canceled Sunday dinners more often, said he was busy, that work was demanding more of him. When we did speak on the phone, there were pauses where there used to be laughter. Once, I had asked him if everything was all right, and he had answered too quickly, his voice just a little too bright. I remember thinking then that he sounded tired. I did not think to question why. Something felt off. I could not explain it. Not yet. But I felt it. And I did not ignore it this time. I stepped back and turned toward the side hallway that led to the smaller reception room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, a few staff members were clearing away trays and stacking chairs, moving quietly as if they understood this was not just another event. I nodded politely as I passed, and no one stopped me. No one asked if I needed anything. It was strange how invisible grief could make a person. In the hallway beyond, the air felt cooler, quieter. This was where the family had gathered earlier, before the service began. Coffee had been set out on a long table, along with small plates of cookies that no one had touched. I remembered standing near the window then, watching people arrive. When Vanessa had stepped just a few feet away, her back partially turned to me. That was when I heard it. Not meant for me. Not meant for anyone, really. Just a low, quiet sentence spoken into the space between her and another person. I could not see who she was speaking to. I had only caught the reflection of movement in the glass. But I had heard her clearly. He died at the perfect time. I moved slowly along the length of the table now, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge as if I were retracing my steps. There was nothing there anymore. No cups. No plates. Just the faint outline where things had been placed earlier. But the feeling remained. That same unease that had settled in my chest the moment I heard her words. I paused near the far end, where a small stack of printed programs had been left behind. I picked one up and looked at it carefully. Daniel's name. The dates. A short paragraph about his life, written in a tone that felt distant, almost clinical. Vanessa must have approved this. Or written it herself. It mentioned his accomplishments. His career. The company he had helped build. But there was nothing about the things that mattered. Nothing about the way he used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask if I needed anything from the store. Nothing about the small, quiet kindnesses that had defined who he really was. I set the program back down and let out a slow breath. Something was missing. Not just from the program. From the entire picture. And I could feel it now, clearer than before. The gaps. The inconsistencies. I thought again about the last time I saw him, sitting at my kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He had been distracted, his eyes drifting toward the door more than once, as if he expected someone to walk in. At the time, I had assumed it was Vanessa, that she might be waiting for him somewhere, that he was worried about being late. But now, Standing here, that memory felt different. Sharper, like it carried a meaning I had missed. I turned and walked back toward the main entrance. The doors were open, and I could see Vanessa standing just outside, speaking with a man in a dark suit. He nodded as she spoke, his posture attentive, almost deferential. She was not just comforting people. She was directing them, guiding the flow of everything around her. My steps slowed as I approached, but I did not go outside. Not yet. Instead, I stopped just inside the doorway, where I could see without being seen too clearly. Vanessa reached into her purse and handed the man something small. A card, perhaps. He took it, glanced down briefly, then slipped it into his pocket. There was a moment, just a brief one, where her expression shifted. The smile faded. Not entirely, just enough to reveal something underneath. Focus. Calculation. Then it was gone, replaced again by that same composed calm. I lowered my gaze and stepped back from the doorway. Let her have the outside. Let her think everything was still under her control. Because I was beginning to understand something now. This was not just about grief. And it was not just about loss. There were pieces of this story that had been carefully arranged, just like the flowers, just like the service. And if I had learned anything from a lifetime of watching people, it was this. When something is arranged too perfectly, it usually means someone worked very hard to make sure no one would look too closely. But I was looking now, and I was not going to stop. I did not confront her that day. I did not ask questions, and I did not let my face betray what had begun to form quietly in my mind. Instead, I stepped outside into the cool air and allowed myself to blend into the small cluster of people still lingering near the entrance. Conversations drifted around me, fragments of sympathy and memory, each one sounding more distant than the last. Vanessa stood a few feet away, still composed, still in control, her voice soft but firm as she spoke with the funeral director now. I noticed how easily people deferred to her, how naturally they followed her lead, as if she had always been the one holding everything together. Perhaps that was the story she had been telling them. Perhaps that was the story she had been telling for a long time. She was in control. Too much control. That was enough. I started paying attention. I kept my distance and watched, not just her, but the way others responded to her. It was not grief I saw in their eyes when they looked at her. It was something closer to respect, or maybe even obligation. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. Because respect can be earned, but obligation is usually built. Slowly, carefully, I turned my attention to the parking lot, where cars were beginning to pull away one by one. The sky had darkened slightly, the gray deepening into something heavier, like a storm deciding whether or not to arrive. I reached into my coat pocket and found my keys, feeling the familiar shape ground me just enough to keep moving. My car was parked farther down, away from the main entrance. I had chosen that spot earlier without thinking. Now it felt like the right choice. A little distance, a little space to think. As I walked, I replayed the past year again, but this time I did not focus on Daniel alone. I focused on the spaces around him, the conversations I was not part of, the decisions that were made without me, the gradual narrowing of access that I had accepted as normal. Vanessa had always been polite to me, always respectful, but there had been a shift, subtle at first, then more defined. Invitations that became suggestions. Suggestions that became updates after the fact. I had adjusted, telling myself it was their life, their marriage, their boundaries. But now, standing here with the weight of what I had heard pressing quietly against every memory, those changes no longer felt natural. They felt directed. I reached my car and paused before unlocking it, my hand resting on the handle as another memory surfaced. It was from late spring, about 6 months ago. Daniel had mentioned something about updating paperwork. He had said it casually, almost as an afterthought, while we were clearing dishes after dinner. I had asked what kind of paperwork, and he had shrugged it off, saying it was just routine things, nothing to worry about. Vanessa had been in the next room at the time. I remember that clearly now, because she had stepped into the doorway just then, her expression unreadable, and said, "We are just making sure everything is organized." At the time, I had nodded, accepted the explanation, and moved on. But standing here now, that moment felt different. Not routine, not casual. Organized for what? I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, closing the door softly behind me. The interior felt still, almost insulated from everything outside. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, but did not start the engine right away. Instead, I let myself sit there, allowing the silence to settle around me. For the first time since the service began, I allowed my thoughts to move freely, without interruption, without the need to appear composed. The phrase returned again, sharper now, more defined. He died at the perfect time. Perfect for something that required preparation. Perfect for something that had already been set in motion. My gaze shifted to the passenger seat, where a small folder rested. I had not noticed it when I first got into the car. It was plain, manila, the kind used for ordinary documents. For a moment, I wondered if it belonged to me, if I had brought it without remembering. But as I reached for it, I realized I had never seen it before. It had been placed there, deliberately. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hands. There was no name on the outside, no label, just a simple tab at the top, slightly bent as if it had been handled more than once. I hesitated for a second, then opened it. Inside were a few sheets of paper, neatly arranged. The first page caught my attention immediately. It was a copy of a bank statement. Daniel's name was printed at the top. Beneath it, a series of transactions. Transfers. Large ones. Moving between accounts I did not recognize. My eyes moved quickly down the page, trying to make sense of the pattern. The dates spanned several months. The amounts were consistent, deliberate. This was not random spending. This was structured, controlled. My grip on the folder tightened slightly as I turned to the next page. Another statement. Another set of transfers. Different account numbers, but the same pattern. The same precision. I felt something shift inside me again, but this time it was not confusion. It was clarity. Not complete. Not yet. But enough to understand that whatever had been happening in Daniel's life, it had not been simple. And it had not been accidental. I closed the folder carefully and set it back on the passenger seat, my movements slow and measured. Someone had placed this here. Someone wanted me to see it. The question was not whether this mattered. It was who had decided it was time for me to know. I finally started the engine, the low hum breaking the silence. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced once more toward the chapel. Vanessa stood near the entrance, speaking to another guest, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. From a distance, she looked exactly as she should. Composed, grieving, in control. I turned my eyes back to the road and drove away. Because now I understood something she did not. Whatever story she had arranged so carefully was beginning to come undone. And I had just been handed the first piece. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I took the longer route, the one that wound past the lake Daniel used to visit when he needed to clear his head. It had been years since I had gone that way, but my hands seemed to remember the turns without needing instruction. The road was quiet, lined with bare trees that stretched thin branches toward the dim sky. I kept my eyes on the pavement, but my thoughts stayed on the folder resting beside me, its presence steady and impossible to ignore. When I finally pulled into a small overlook by the water, I turned off the engine and let the silence return. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the dull gray of the afternoon like a sheet of glass. Daniel used to say that this place made everything feel smaller, more manageable. I wondered what he would say now. I reached for the folder again, this time opening it with more intention. The first 2 pages I had already seen, but now I looked closer. The account numbers repeated in patterns, certain digits appearing again and again as if they were connected. The transfers were not random. They moved in intervals, every 2 weeks, sometimes every month, always within a similar range. It was careful, planned. I saw that now. I turned to the 3rd page and felt my breath slow slightly. This one was different. It was not a bank statement. It was a printed confirmation of a property transfer. The address was unfamiliar, but the name listed beneath it was not. Vanessa Collins. The date caught my attention immediately. It was from just 4 months ago. I stared at the page for a long moment, letting the details settle into place. Daniel had never mentioned buying property. Not to me. And yet here it was, documented and complete. I thought back to the conversations we had during that time. Short calls, quick visits, nothing that hinted at a major purchase. Unless he had not been the one making the decision. It was not just one moment. It never is. It builds. I placed the page back down and leaned my head lightly against the seat, closing my eyes for just a second. The pattern was beginning to form more clearly now. The transfers, the property, the quiet distance that had grown between Daniel and everything that used to be familiar to him. It was not one event. It was a series of changes, each one small enough to go unnoticed, but together forming something much larger. I opened my eyes and looked out at the lake again, the stillness of it almost unsettling. My mind shifted back further now, past the past year, to smaller moments that had not meant much at the time. Vanessa taking phone calls in another room and lowering her voice when I entered. Daniel checking his watch more often, cutting visits short with vague explanations. The way he had once hesitated when I asked if he was happy. He had smiled then, but it had not reached his eyes. I had told myself it was stress, work, marriage, all the ordinary things people say when they do not want to look too closely. I straightened slightly in my seat and returned my attention to the folder. There was one more page. I had not looked at it yet. It was folded once, tucked behind the others. I unfolded it carefully and felt a subtle shift in my chest as I began to read. It was an email, or rather, a printed copy of one. The header showed Daniel's name, but the message itself was incomplete, as if it had never been sent. The subject line was simple: I need to talk. The body of the message was short, but each word carried weight. He had written that something was not right, that he felt like decisions were being made without him, that accounts he thought he controlled were being accessed in ways he did not understand. He mentioned feeling watched, managed. The final line stopped abruptly, cut off mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted or had decided not to finish. I read it again, slower this time, letting each phrase settle. This was not confusion. This was awareness. Daniel had known something was wrong. He had tried to say it, even if only to himself. I lowered the page and let it rest in my lap. The quiet around me felt different now, heavier, as if it was holding more than just silence. It was holding answers that had not yet been spoken out loud. I thought about Vanessa again, about the way she had moved through the funeral, guiding everything with such precision. That kind of control does not appear overnight. It is built, maintained, protected. I closed the folder once more, this time with a sense of purpose that had not been there before. Whoever had placed it in my car had not done so by accident. They had chosen this moment, this day, and that meant they believed I was ready to see it. Or perhaps they believed I was the only one who would. I reached for my keys and started the engine again, the sound breaking through the stillness of the overlook. As I pulled back onto the road, I no longer felt the same uncertainty that had followed me from the chapel. It had been replaced by something quieter, but far more solid. Understanding. Not complete, not yet, but enough to know that Daniel's life and his death were not as simple as they had been presented. And if there was one thing I had learned from raising a son like him, it was this: he did not give up easily. If he had tried to leave a message, even one that was never sent, then it meant he wanted someone to find it. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel slightly and focused on the road ahead, because now it was my turn to listen to what he had been trying to say. And this time, I was not going to miss it. I did not go straight home that evening. Instead, I drove past my street and continued another 2 miles until I reached the small grocery store Daniel used to stop at on his way back from work. It was not because I needed anything. It was because I needed time. Time to think without walls around me, without memories pressing in from every corner. I parked under a dim light near the far end of the lot and turned off the engine. The folder sat beside me, quiet but heavy, like it had been waiting for me to understand its weight. I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, staring ahead at the store's glass doors as people moved in and out, carrying bags, talking, living lives untouched by what I had just uncovered. It felt distant, separate, like I was watching a world I no longer quite belonged to. After a while, I reached for the folder but did not open it right away. I ran my fingers along the edge instead, tracing the crease where it had been folded. Daniel used to bring home folders like this all the time, dropping them on my kitchen table with a tired smile, saying he would deal with them later. He rarely did. I would straighten the papers for him, stack them neatly, pretend I was helping in a way that still mattered. I swallowed slowly and finally opened it. The first pages were the same. Bank statements, transfers, numbers lined up in careful rows. I read them again, slower this time, letting each detail settle instead of rushing past it. The patterns were clearer now, too clear to ignore. I knew then. I turned to the next page and paused. The property transfer. Vanessa's name printed cleanly beneath the address. The date. For months ago. I stared at it longer than I needed to, my eyes fixed on the line as if it might shift into something else if I waited. Daniel had never mentioned this. Not once. That was enough. I thought back to the last few times we sat together in my kitchen. He had seemed distracted, yes, but there had been moments when he almost said something. I remember him picking up his coffee, then setting it back down without taking a sip. "Mom, I need to," he had started once, then stopped, glancing toward the door like he expected someone to walk in. I had not pressed him. I told myself he would tell me when he was ready. I did not ask again. I looked down at the paper and felt that moment settle differently now. He had been ready. He just had not been able to finish. I placed the page carefully on my lap and leaned back against the seat, my eyes closing for just a second. The air inside the car felt still, almost too quiet. I could hear faint sounds from the store across the lot. A cart rolling. A door opening. Ordinary things. I opened my eyes again and continued through the folder. The final page caught my attention more than the others. The unfinished email. I read it again, slower this time. Not just the words, but the space between them. Something was not right. Accounts he thought he controlled were being accessed. He felt watched. Managed. I exhaled softly, my hand tightening slightly around the paper. Daniel had always been careful. Not paranoid. Not suspicious by nature. If he wrote something like this, it meant he had seen enough to know something was wrong. I understood that now. I lowered the paper and looked out through the windshield again, my reflection faint in the glass. For a moment, I saw myself the way others probably did. A quiet woman sitting alone in a parked car, holding a folder of papers. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about it suggested that everything underneath had shifted. But it had. I gathered the documents slowly and placed them back into the folder, keeping them in the same order. Not because it mattered to anyone else, but because it mattered to me. Order had always been how I made sense of things. Even now, it was the only way forward. I set the folder on the passenger seat and rested my hand on top of it for a moment. Someone had placed this here. Someone had decided I needed to see it. That thought did not frighten me. It steadied me, because it meant Daniel had not been entirely alone in what he had discovered. It meant there was still a thread to follow. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine starting with a low, familiar sound. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The store lights blurred slightly as I drove away, but the feeling remained. Not grief, not confusion, something quieter, something more focused. I kept both hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead. Because now I understood one thing clearly. Daniel had tried to leave a path, and I was finally ready to follow it. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was restless, but because my mind refused to slow down. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same sequence of details repeating with sharper clarity. The bank statements, the property transfer, the unfinished email. Each piece felt deliberate, placed in front of me not as a complete answer, but as a trail. And trails, I had learned over a lifetime, only exist when someone wants to be followed. By morning, the house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that usually felt comforting but now carried a different weight. I moved through my routine slowly, making coffee, setting a single cup on the counter, listening to the low hum of the machine as if it could steady my thoughts. The sunlight came through the kitchen window in narrow lines, cutting across the floor in a way that reminded me of that afternoon with Daniel at the table. The memory felt closer now, more precise. He had not just been distracted. He had been holding something back. I took my coffee into the study and closed the door behind me. The folder remained where I had placed it, tucked beneath the stack of papers in the bottom drawer. I pulled it out and set it on the desk, opening it again with the same careful attention as before. This time, I focused on the details I had missed. The names of the accounts, the institutions, the routing numbers. I wrote them down slowly on a notepad, copying each line exactly as it appeared. I did not rush. There was no reason to. If someone had gone to this much effort to make sure I saw this, then I needed to be just as deliberate in understanding it. When I finished, I sat back and looked at the list. 3 different accounts, all linked through consistent transfers. 2 of them were in Daniel's name. The third was not. It was listed under a business entity I did not recognize. I read the name again, letting it settle. It did not match anything Daniel had ever mentioned. No company he had worked for. No investment he had discussed. Which meant one of 2 things. Either it had nothing to do with him, or it had everything to do with something he had not been allowed to explain. I reached for my phone and hesitated. There was one person I could call. One person who might be able to tell me what this meant without raising questions too. quickly, but calling too soon, without enough context, could close doors before I even knew where they led. I set the phone back down. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to the email again, reading it slowly, this time focusing not just on the words, but on the tone. Daniel had not sounded panicked. He had sounded controlled, careful, as if he knew he was stepping into something he could not fully see, but needed to document anyway. The phrase stayed with me. Accounts he thought he controlled were being accessed in ways he did not understand. That meant access had been shared, or taken. And in a marriage, shared access is common. Normal, even. But this did not feel normal. This felt one-sided. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured Vanessa again. The way she had moved through the funeral with quiet authority, the way people had looked to her for direction. Control was not new to her. It was practiced, refined. I opened my eyes and reached for the property transfer page again. The address was still unfamiliar, but now I paid closer attention to the details beneath it. County records, filing number, the kind of information that could be traced if you knew where to look. I wrote that down as well, adding it to the list. Piece by piece, the outline was forming. Not the full picture, not yet, but enough to begin asking the right questions. It was not random. It was planned. I saw the pattern. I could not unsee it. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. Nothing had changed out there. Cars passed occasionally. A neighbor walked by with a dog. Ordinary movement. Ordinary life. And yet, beneath that surface, something had been happening in my own family that I had not seen, or perhaps had chosen not to see. That thought settled heavily, but I did not push it away. If I had missed the signs before, I was not going to miss them now. I turned back to the desk and gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the folder in the same order I had found them. Then I returned it to the drawer, closing it with quiet precision. This was not something to leave exposed. Not yet. I picked up my phone again, this time without hesitation, and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. I did not press call. Not yet. Instead, I studied it for a moment, considering what I needed to say, and more importantly, what I needed to hear. Because once I started asking questions, I would not be able to step back. Whatever answers came next would change everything. I set the phone down again and took a slow breath, steadying myself. There was a right way to do this. A careful way. And if Vanessa had spent months, maybe longer, building whatever this was, then I could take a little more time to understand it fully. I moved back into the kitchen, finished my coffee, and set the cup in the sink. From the outside, it would look like an ordinary morning. A quiet house. A routine day beginning. But inside, something had already shifted into motion. I was no longer just remembering. I was paying attention. And for the first time since I heard those words in the chapel, I felt certain of one thing. This was not over. It had just begun. I waited until mid-afternoon before I made the call. Not because I needed more time to think, but because I needed the right kind of quiet. The kind where no one expects anything from you, where the world slows down just enough to let a conversation happen without interruption. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me, the same place where Daniel and I had shared so many ordinary moments that now felt anything but ordinary. The number was still there in my contacts, unchanged, familiar. Thomas Reynolds. He had been Daniel's colleague for years, but more than that, he had been someone Daniel trusted. I had met him a handful of times, always polite, always attentive, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. That detail mattered now more than it ever had before. I picked up the phone and pressed call before I could second-guess the decision. It rang twice before he answered. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something careful. "Margaret," he said, as if he had been expecting me. I did not ask how he knew it was me. I simply responded, keeping my tone even. "Thomas, I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." There was a brief pause, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice. "No," he replied. "I was actually hoping you would call." That answer settled something in me immediately. He had been waiting, which meant I was not the only one who had seen the cracks forming. He already knew. I was not alone in this. That mattered, more than I expected. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hand resting lightly against the table. "I found something yesterday," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Documents. In my car." Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then a quiet exhale. "I was wondering if you would," he said. The room felt still around me, the air shifting just enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. "So it was you," I said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Yes," he answered. No hesitation. No attempt to deflect. Just a simple confirmation. I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me. "Then I assume you know what they mean." "Some of it," he replied. "Not all, but enough to know Daniel was trying to tell someone before." He stopped there, leaving the sentence unfinished. I did not need him to complete it. Before he could, I said quietly, "Yes." The word lingered between us, heavy but controlled. I let a few seconds pass, allowing the weight of that acknowledgement to settle. "Why did you not come to me directly?" I asked. "Why leave it in my car?" There was a shift in his tone when he answered, something more cautious now. "Because I did not know who was watching," he said. "And I still do not." That answer tightened something in my chest, not fear, but clarity. This was not just about information. It was about exposure. Risk. I leaned forward slightly, my voice lowering without effort. "You believe Vanessa is involved?" It was not a question, but I wanted to hear how he would respond. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his words were measured. "I believe she had access to things Daniel did not fully understand," he said. "And I believe he became aware of it too late." I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle into place alongside everything else. "The accounts," I said. "The transfers. The property." "Yes," Thomas replied. "That property is not just a purchase. It is connected to the third account, the one under the business name." I opened my eyes again, my focus sharpening. "What kind of business?" Another pause. "This one deliberate." "A shell," he said finally. "At least, that is what it appears to be. It does not operate publicly. No visible services. No clear revenue stream. But it moves money. Consistently." I felt the pieces align more clearly now, the pattern no longer abstract. Structured transfers. Hidden accounts. A property tied to an entity that did not exist in any meaningful way. "And Daniel knew," I said. "He suspected," Thomas corrected gently. "He came to me about 2 months ago, asked if I could take a look at some irregularities. At the time, it seemed like a simple audit issue, something internal. But the more I looked, the more it did not make sense." I stood slowly and walked to the window, my gaze fixed on the quiet street outside. "Why did he not tell me?" I asked, more to myself than to him. "He was trying to protect you," Thomas said. "And I think he was not sure how far it went, or who else might be involved." I let that sit for a moment, then turned back toward the table. "You said you do not know who is watching," I said. "What does that mean?" His answer came carefully, each word placed with intention. "It means that if Vanessa is part of this, she is not acting alone. And if she is not alone, then there are others who benefit from keeping things exactly as they are." The room felt colder then, not physically, but in a way that settled deeper. This was no longer just about my son's marriage or his finances. This was larger, more deliberate. "What do we do?" I asked. Thomas did not hesitate this time. "We move carefully," he said. "We do not confront her. Not yet. We gather everything we can. Quietly. Because if she realizes you know, whatever trail Daniel left behind could disappear." I nodded again, my expression steady. "Then we do it your way," I said. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet acknowledgement. "I will send you a list," he said. "Things to look for. Records. That might still be accessible. We start there." I ended the call a moment later and set the phone down gently on the table. For a long second, I did not move. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt active, as if something had been set in motion, something that could not be undone. I walked back toward the study, my steps calm, deliberate. The drawer was still closed, the folder still hidden. But now, it was no longer just a collection of documents. It was evidence. And I was no longer just a grieving mother trying to understand what had happened. I was part of something else now, something that required patience, precision, and above all, silence. I opened the drawer and looked down at the folder for a moment before closing it again. Because Thomas was right. If she realized I knew, everything could disappear. And I was not going to let that happen. The rest of that day unfolded quietly on the surface, but underneath, everything had begun to move. I followed the list Thomas sent me with careful attention, not rushing, not skipping ahead, treating each step as if it mattered on its own, because now I understood that it did. The first item was simple. Public property records. The address listed in the transfer document, could be searched without raising suspicion. Anyone could look it up. That was the point. I sat at the desk in the study, my laptop open, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly against the framed photo nearby. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard as I entered the address exactly as it appeared. The page loaded after a few seconds, revealing a standard county record interface, plain and unremarkable. I scrolled down until I found the entry. The owner listed was the same, Vanessa Collins. But there was another detail beneath it that had not been immediately obvious on the printed copy. The property had been transferred from the business entity I had written down earlier, not purchased in the traditional sense. Moved. Internally, I leaned back slightly, letting that distinction settle. This was not a new acquisition. It was a repositioning, a step in a process, not the beginning of one. I clicked through the available documents, each one revealing small pieces of the same pattern. Filing dates, transaction references, legal descriptions. All clean, all properly recorded. Nothing that would raise concern on its own. That was the unsettling part. It was designed to look correct. I copied the filing numbers into my notes, adding them to the list I had started earlier. The second item on Thomas's list required more care. Bank access. I did not have Daniel's login information, and even if I had, using it now could create a record I did not understand. But there were other ways to confirm what I had seen. Statements that had been mailed. Notifications that might still exist. I moved to the small cabinet in the study where Daniel used to keep his things when he visited. It was not something I had gone through before. It felt like crossing a line, but that line no longer held the same meaning it once did. I opened the cabinet slowly and began sorting through the contents. Old folders, receipts, a few unopened envelopes, most of it ordinary. Then I found a stack of mail, bound loosely with a rubber band. I sat down and began to go through it piece by piece. Utility notices, insurance updates. Then, about halfway through, I found what I was looking for. A bank envelope, unopened, addressed to Daniel. The date was recent, just 2 weeks ago. I held it for a moment before opening it, aware that this was not just information anymore. It was confirmation. Inside was a printed statement. I scanned it quickly, then more slowly, comparing the entries to the copies in the folder. They matched, not just in amount, but in timing. The same pattern, the same intervals. Only this version included something the others did not. A note at the bottom, a message about account access changes. Authorized user updated. The name was partially obscured by the formatting, but enough remained visible to make the connection clear. Vanessa. I set the paper down carefully, my mind moving ahead of the evidence now, connecting pieces that had once felt separate. Access had not just been shared. It had been altered, expanded, formalized, and Daniel had noticed. Too late, but not without trying to understand it. I continued through the stack, finding 2 more statements, each one reinforcing the same pattern. Nothing random, nothing accidental. Each document aligned with the others, building a structure that was difficult to ignore once seen in full. I gathered the papers and placed them neatly beside the folder, my movements steady. The third item on the list was the most delicate. Communication. Emails. Messages. Not the kind that could be accessed without permission, but the kind that might still exist in places people forget. Old devices. Archived accounts. I looked around the study again, my eyes settling on the small drawer beneath the desk. It was not one I had opened before. I reached down and pulled it open slowly. Inside was a tablet. Older, not used recently. I picked it up and pressed the power button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered to life. It took a few seconds to load, but when it did, I saw the familiar interface of Daniel's email account. Still logged in. Still active. I sat back in the chair and held the tablet in both hands, my grip careful but firm. This was not just a possibility anymore. It was access. I navigated slowly, opening the inbox, scanning the subject lines, the dates. Most were ordinary. Work correspondence. Updates. Routine exchanges. Then I found a folder labeled drafts. I paused for a moment, then opened it. The unfinished email I had read earlier was there, but it was not alone. There were others. Short messages. Partial thoughts. Each one written, then abandoned. Some mentioned numbers. Others mentioned names I did not recognize. One stood out more than the rest. It was addressed to Thomas. The subject line read simply, "If something happens." I did not open it immediately. Instead, I set the tablet down on the desk and let my hands rest on either side of it. The room felt different now, not just quiet, but charged, as if every object around me held a piece of something that had been hidden in plain sight. He tried to say something, more than once. I was just too late to hear it. Not this time. I looked toward the door, then back at the tablet. This was the moment where everything could shift again. Not gradually, not subtly, but completely. I reached forward and tapped the screen. Because whatever Daniel had tried to say, I was finally in a position to hear it. I opened the message slowly, my finger hovering for just a fraction of a second before pressing the screen, as if I already understood that whatever I was about to read would not just answer questions, but change the shape of everything I thought I knew. The email expanded in front of me, the text simple, unformatted, written in the same careful tone I had begun to recognize in Daniel's other drafts. If something happens, I need you to know that I tried to fix it before it got worse. It began. I felt my breath steady, not quicken, as I read on. I do not think this is just a mistake anymore. I have been reviewing the accounts, and there are transfers I did not authorize, but they are being approved through credentials that appear valid. I cannot trace how access was expanded, but it was not done in a way that leaves an obvious record. I paused there, letting the words settle, then continued. I believe Vanessa is aware of the accounts, but I do not know if she understands the full structure. There are entities connected to these transfers that I cannot link directly to her, but they intersect with changes she requested over the past 6 months. If I am wrong, then I am overthinking something that can be corrected. But if I am right, then this is bigger than I can handle on my own. I lowered the tablet slightly, my eyes moving across the room without really seeing it, then lifted it again and continued reading. I have started documenting everything I can, but I have to be careful. Access logs are inconsistent, and I am beginning to think someone is monitoring activity more closely than I expected. If that is the case, then anything obvious will be noticed. I am going to move some funds temporarily, just enough to test whether the system reacts. If it does, then I will know for sure that someone is watching. The next line was shorter, but it carried more weight than the rest. If you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to explain it myself. I felt my grip tighten, slightly, but my expression did not change. I read the final lines more slowly, each word deliberate. Do not confront her without proof. Do not assume she is alone. And do not trust that what you see is the full picture. If something happens, follow the accounts, not the people. The accounts will tell the truth. The message ended there. No signature, no closing, just a blank space beneath the last sentence, as if he had intended to add more and never had the chance. He knew, not everything, but enough. I sat back in the chair, the tablet resting in my hands, and let the silence of the room settle around me again. But it was not the same silence as before. It was clearer now, sharper. Everything Daniel had written aligned with what I had already begun to uncover. The transfers, the third account, the property, none of it was isolated. It was part of a system, a structure that had been built quietly, carefully, over time. And Vanessa was inside that structure, whether she understood all of it or not. I set the tablet down gently on the desk and leaned forward, my hands resting on the surface as I looked at the papers I had gathered. For a long moment, I did not move. I simply observed. The documents, the notes, the patterns. Then I reached for the notepad and began writing again, this time not copying information, but organizing it. Dates aligned in columns. Account numbers grouped together. Property records connected to transaction sequences. Piece by piece, I laid it out in front of me, not as scattered evidence, but as a coherent map. It did not take long for the pattern to become unmistakable. The transfers were not just moving money. They were redistributing it, routing it through layers that made it difficult to trace unless you knew where to look. And Daniel had known, or at least, he had been close enough to understanding that he had tried to document it before something interrupted him. I stopped writing and looked down at the page, my pen still in my hand. Follow the accounts, not the people. The instruction echoed quietly in my mind, steady and clear. It all connected, too clean to be a coincidence. It was not just advice. It was a strategy. Because people could lie, people could hide, but systems, no matter how carefully constructed, always left traces. I stood slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the street as the light began to shift toward evening. The world outside remained unchanged, unaware of what had been set in motion inside this house. But I was no longer looking for change out there. I was looking for it here, in the details, in the connections. I turned back to the desk and picked up the folder again, flipping through the pages one more time, but this time with a different focus. Not what the documents said individually, but how they interacted. The timing of the transfers matched the dates on the property filings. The account changes aligned with the periods Daniel had grown distant. Even the email drafts fit into the sequence, marking the point where suspicion had turned into awareness. It was all there. Not complete, but enough. Enough to move forward. I closed the folder and placed it carefully back into the drawer, then picked up the tablet and powered it off, returning it to its place beneath the desk. Nothing about this room should look disturbed. Nothing should suggest that anything had changed. I stepped back and looked around once more, confirming that everything appeared as it had before. Because Daniel had been right about one thing above all else. If someone was watching, then the smallest change could matter. I left the study and moved through the house with the same calm, deliberate pace, turning off lights, straightening objects, maintaining the rhythm of an ordinary evening. From the outside, nothing had shifted, but inside, everything had. I understood the structure now. Not completely, but enough to recognize where it could break. And more importantly, how to reach that point without being seen. I paused at the kitchen counter, resting my hands lightly against the surface as I allowed one final thought to settle into place. Vanessa believed she was in control. She believed everything had been arranged, contained, resolved. She believed that whatever Daniel had known had ended with him. I lifted my eyes slightly, my expression steady, my breathing even. I understood. Now. And I was not going to stop.